Earth grief, that deep aching feeling every time I hear about or witness the destruction of nature, is something that I've dealt with for most of my life. I will see little children playing in the park and be hit with this intense sense of melancholy when I think about their future on this dying planet, and feeling so utterly powerless in my ability to protect them from that. I'm often inundated with this ever-present sinking feeling whenever I use a car or throw rubbish in the bin, feeling so guilty for my contribution to ecocide. When I'm in nature, there's often that bittersweet feeling. All the awe that I feel for the beauty of the world is simultaneously punctured by a certain kind of sadness. I will be admiring the ocean and its sea creatures, then find myself ruminating about declining fish populations and sea levels rising. And sometimes when I look around and everyone is going about their normal 9-to-5 jobs, I just feel like screaming, the earth is dying, why is no one doing anything about this? And all these feelings are also accompanied by loneliness and isolation, because grieving the earth is completely incomprehensible to most people around me as matters of grief. Whilst this earth grief will likely be with me for the rest of my life, over time I've found ways to navigate it so it's not quite so emotionally and existentially overwhelming, that I'd love to share with you today. I know I'm coming at this from a privileged position. I definitely don't have all the answers. I haven't mastered any of this stuff. I'm making this video as much for myself as for anyone else. I hope this can be more of a conversation starter rather than a definitive list of solutions. One of the quickest ways I can prevent myself from spiraling into earth despair is to reframe how I'm thinking about the climate crisis. I like to remind myself that to prevent collapse is a challenge, not an impossibility. When I'm feeling sad about nature, I remind myself that there is an honor in sadness. It's an honor to have this much connection, sensitivity, and love for the earth. I like to turn the guilt that I feel for my contribution to ecocide into responsibility, transforming complicity into a commitment to live differently from this moment forward. I like to use the phrase, "that's interesting," to diffuse spiraling into despair. Okay, so we're facing climate catastrophe. That's interesting. Where do we go from here? Where does this leave me? What is my role in this? When movements are failing, or when I feel like I'm not doing enough, I ask myself, what can I learn from this? Where can I go from here? Instead of feeling the dread of being alive at a time like this, I like to remind myself that it's a terrible gift to be alive at a time of such immense change. This isn't about naive positivity or trying to bright side suffering. It's about evoking curiosity to transform pain into concrete steps forward. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, when asked what's the most important thing we can do for the sake of life on earth, didn't go strategic at all. He said, the most important thing we need to do is to hear within ourselves the sound of the earth crying. To hear within ourselves the sound of the earth crying, I think, means to really allow ourselves the time and the space to feel earth grief, to be present with the sensations, to deeply listen to our emotions. If we don't allow ourselves to feel the grief, we often become numb, dead inside, apathetic, which results in an unwillingness to respond to or acknowledge the destruction of nature. So for me, the most helpful practice I have found to truly feel my feelings is to self-soothe, to say hello to my sadness. I see you, I hear you, I accept you, I understand that you're having a hard time. It's okay that you're feeling this way. I'm proud of you for feeling your feelings. Like a parent that is holding a baby that is sad, I embrace my suffering with love and compassion. I give it a good hug and a squeeze. The more that I allow myself to truly feel my grief and to hear within myself the sound of the earth crying, the easier it is for me to let go of and release my grief. One of the struggles of earth grief is that it can be so lonely and isolating because so few people understand it, and there's this social expectation that grief should be hidden away, buried, privatized. That's why I think it can be so helpful to build what the anthropologist Hilariano Alcala calls communities of mourning. Finding people who share in the understanding that mourning is a legitimate response to the destruction that we are seeing. I had an experience with an environmental group a few years ago where we would regularly come together and talk about places in nature that we had felt deeply connected to. We'd talk about why they meant a lot to us, what they meant to us, and many of these places no longer existed. So it was a space for us to come together and laugh and cry, and it was a deeply healing experience. It's a way to build emotional solidarity, a way to mobilize our grief into action, and a way for us to see that we're not alone in our mourning for the loss of nature.
Tears that cleanse, hearts that open and get washed together, and words that get spoken of our anguish. What a deliverance to realize that that's not a private burden, but a shared experience with our brothers and sisters.
Even though I just spoke about feeling our feelings, I don't think earth grief has to be processed or has to be let go of. There are so many examples throughout history where people held onto their grief in order to mobilize action. There was the public mourning of AIDS victims in the 1980s in an attempt to redefine the AIDS body as grievable. There was the ritualized resistant mourning and protest movement of the mothers of the disappeared children in Argentina in the 1970s in order to shame the dictatorship. And there was the open coffin at the funeral of Emmett Till in 1955, in which his mother publicized the injustice mapped on her son's lynched corpse. In the same way, we can make our earth grief political through resistant mourning movements as a way to tell the world that we refuse to engage in climate denial, distraction, disassociation. We refuse to pathologize or manage our grief in order to be led back to conformity, and we refuse to be gaslit about our grief when this pain is a normal, healthy response to all the destruction around us. It's a way of telling the world that the earth is worthy of being grieved and mobilizing others to join the fight to save the planet. Sometimes earth grief comes from feeling so totally overwhelmed by the gravity of work that needs to be done to save the planet. There's often this sense that nothing less than the most revolutionary, large-scale movements are worth fighting for, and if we can't contribute on this scale, then we conclude that everything we do is pointless, meaningless, so we might as well give up. And of course, this leads us into despair and earth grief. When I find myself feeling this way, the activist and author Adrienne Marie Brown is my biggest inspiration. In the book Emergent Strategy, she talks about how she views humans as operating within an ecosystem. Just as within an ecosystem, everything has their unique function, the beaver, the tree, the flower, each playing their part. In the same way, we as humans also have our functions. Maybe you're a carer, maybe you're amazing at art, maybe you're great at agitating or educating. Whatever it may be, our unique gifts, skills, passions, interests lead us to have our own unique roles within our ecosystems. If we were all to follow the same rigid blueprint of actions, our movements would quickly fail. For me, consolidating my caring in this way has been one of the greatest antidotes to earth despair. No longer am I inundated with the weight of the world's problems on my shoulders. Instead, I focus on what I'm good at, what lights me up. I have a compass for my actions, helping me to consciously pick my battles out of all the possibilities, giving me purpose and direction. Most discussions around climate change frames the issue as if we have a certain amount of time to avoid disaster. We have a deadline of about 10 years where we either stop ecocide or we're doomed. And if we don't make it, there will be total apocalypse, annihilation. There is no world beyond it. Naturally, this leads many people to earth grief because very few people actually think that we'll reach these targets. But this climate narrative is misleading. Yes, things will radically change. Yes, it will be terrible in many ways. Yes, people are going to die. But even in the case of annihilation, there will be something on the other side. We've seen this happen so many times throughout history. The colonial narrative of Native Americans is that they were totally annihilated, but despite all the brutality, life never ended. They continue to love, dream, rebel. In the same way, the author Rebecca Solnit talks of how disaster-ravaged communities, far from annihilating everything, actually unites people through the common cause of their desperation. And we even see this tendency within nature, where the annihilation of all life in a mass forest fire actually creates the conditions for shoots of small trees to grow, where seed pods can only explode in great heat. I don't say this to romanticize destruction, and of course this isn't a moment for false optimism. We do need to be realistically prepared that annihilation could happen, but what I am saying is that instead of being consumed by earth grief, that there is no hope, that apocalypse is coming, to remind ourselves that things don't just end. There is a world beyond this. We learn to live in ruins. The fight always goes on. And in the destruction of something, there's often room for something new to take its place. Not that this doesn't come with loss, grief, devastation, but there's also resilience, the beauty of survival, and a whole new world of possibility. When it comes to the future of the planet, many of us are deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. We want to know that things will be okay. We want to know that our efforts to save the planet will pay off. But Buddhists have long argued that what makes us miserable is not uncertainty, insecurity, or our lack of control over the unfolding future, but our efforts to escape it. Insecurity is the essential nature of the universe. All beings, plants, civilizations grow, change, and die. All forms of life, including the life of the planet itself, have always been accompanied by an ever-present reality of impermanence and extinction. So Buddhists argue that instead of clinging to try and find stability, certainty, security, control, we should practice radical acceptance that there never will be any. Acceptance that suffering is inevitable, acceptance that we will never know if our actions will bear any fruit, acceptance that the world may end, acceptance that on a cosmic scale we are all utterly insignificant, we will all soon be forgotten, and what we do probably won't matter all that much. This seems counter to everything we're usually taught, because people say that if we practice acceptance, we will slip into inaction or self-indulgence. But I think the opposite can be the case, because if we have practiced radical acceptance, we no longer become so demoralized, defeatist, burnt out whenever we hear that the world is dying, or when the actions that we take don't have the results that we want, because we've already accepted it. Radical acceptance essentially means that we're less likely to experience earth grief because our mood isn't so dependent on external circumstances that are outside of our control. Stan Rushworth, a teacher of Native American literature, wrote that Indigenous elders of Northern California will say that the most important thing we can do for the sake of the planet is to be so quiet in our beings that we constantly hear the soft singing of Misa Misa, the spirit that resides within the mountains that guides us onto the correct course of action within our lives. So for me, one of the best things I can do when I'm feeling earth grief is to go and spend time in nature, attempting to listen to nature. Not only is this incredibly restorative and healing, but as Stan Rushworth is talking about, there is something about being away from the noise of everyday life, being so still within my being and listening, that orientates me towards the correct course of action in my life. I start noticing the world around me with all my senses, seeing which being in nature captures my attention and spending time with that life form. Over time, a series of impressions, thoughts, feelings, images start to come to me. Suddenly I get a pull to do something, ideas or a set of instructions come to me. I essentially channel my earth grief into concrete steps forward on behalf of the planet, so I have purpose and direction rather than being stuck in debilitating despair. There's also something about the humility of deep listening rather than the egoic striving to be saviors of the planet that profoundly calms me down. Like we don't have to figure out everything by ourselves. There are teachers and guides all around us, intelligences other than our own. The botanist and author Robin Wall Kimmerer, who teaches environmental biology, asks her students 2 questions. The first question is, do you love nature? Every hand in the room goes up. The second question is, do you believe that nature loves you in return? Every hand in the room goes down, at which point Robin says, then we have a problem already. And the problem is that we see ourselves as inherently destructive, as parasites on Earth, which means that there is absolutely no hope that we could ever save the planet. If we have so much self-loathing, self-hatred, and such a grim understanding of our place on this earth, then of course we will be inundated with earth grief. So Robin Wall Kimmerer argues that one of the most important things we can do to heal our earth grief is to heal our notion of ourselves within the earth, to see ourselves as healers of the earth rather than destroyers of it, to see ourselves as gardeners and the earth as a garden, to see that we love the earth and the earth loves us back. And this isn't about naively deluding ourselves into believing that the earth loves us and that we are the healers of the earth. It's about actively living that into reality. And for this, I've found it profoundly helpful to learn from the long tradition of Indigenous cultures across the globe that have been practicing a mutually beneficial relationship with nature, being engaged in conversation with the earth, seeing themselves as caretakers and stewards of the gifts they have been given from nature. Some people practice reciprocity by donating to nature orgs or making art that invites reflection about our relationship to nature. But for me, gardening has been one of the best ways to practice reciprocity and to heal my notion of myself within the earth. There's something about holding the earth in my hands that feels like such an intimate act of care as a parent holds a child and is responsible for it. But also seeing the vegetables and the fruit that grow from the earth makes me feel like I am a child nourished by a loving parent. I nurture the earth and the earth nurtures me. Truly feeling the exchange of love between me and the earth, that the earth loves me back and wants the best for me, has been profoundly healing. In order to heal earth grief, I think it's so important that we're willing to do the work that awe requires. It takes work to have gratitude for the wonders of the world when we're constantly inundated with news about all that is going wrong. It takes work to focus on the joy of life when there is so much to grieve. It takes work to see the beauty in the destruction. As Adrienne Marie Brown says, what we focus on grows. If we focus so much on the problem that we can't see beyond it, we will be inundated with apathy, lethargy, and grief. But if we choose to believe that we live on an enchanted planet, that our lives are miraculous, it can be profoundly restorative and healing. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us. Life is full of sorrow, but life is also full of miracles, moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair. The author Joanna Macy is my biggest inspiration in this respect. Despite having worked as a climate activist for most of her life, she still manages to see the wonder and the joy in life.
The simple act of being glad you're alive. What a magic that is. Oh, wow, get a load of this. Hallelujah. I didn't create this, but here I am. I have hands. I have breath. I have eyes that can see. There are trees out there. Here's another person talking to me. Wow. There's the sun and the moon. So simple. I didn't create this body that stood by me so well for over 80 years, nor did I create the conditions that over billions of years nurtured life to allow you and me to emerge in this time. So there's a kind of a mystery to that, and to be alive now when things are really dicey. If you want an adventure, boy, what a time to choose to be alive, to get a chance to find out what you have inside you in terms of vitality and alertness and courage, what you have to discover in terms of what we can do together.
And as Joanna seems to be saying, if we are all doomed, then why not enjoy the last stages of humanity, the music, the art, the love, the friendships? We can still do the work that is required, whilst knowing that if all this beauty will soon not be here, then we can cherish it, revel in it, bask in it before it's all gone. The Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist Viktor Frankl wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's way with death in mind as our species exits the stage." To choose one's way with death in mind as our species exits the stage. For me, what a lot of this comes down to is the ability to hold two truths at once, to recognize that apocalypse could happen, whilst also being aware that there's room for a whole new world of possibility beyond it, to process and release our feelings, whilst also holding on to them in order to mobilize political action. To know that we are destroyers of the world, whilst also believing ourselves to be healers of it. To surrender to the fact that the world may end, whilst also refusing to accept it. To disdain toxic positivity, whilst also optimistically trying to reframe how we are feeling. To recognize the gravity of work that we need to do in order to save the planet, whilst also making peace with our small contribution. And to be aware of the horrors of the world, whilst also reveling in its beauty and its wonders. I would love to hear what have been some of your experiences of eco-grief and what you've done to navigate this sense of loss. And if you like this video, I think everything that I said in my video on radical hope is equally applicable. I'd really appreciate if you could consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and becoming a patron to help me to improve the quality and quantity of the videos that I make. I really can't express my gratitude enough for my current patrons for helping to make these videos possible. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Bye.